This video essay focuses on the ambivalence towards modernity that is in the Giallo film The Fifth Chord, and to highlight this best I'll start with this extended scene. In this it starts by showing the recording tapes being heard which a killer has recorded. While this is playing it pans from one tape to another until it leads to another cut of the multi-storey office facility. The old and the new is highlighted from going from the old style housing, along with construction, and then back to the offices once again. The transition at the start highlights one of the main themes of the film, which is that of modernism. The sweeping city landscapes, newly developed for the 70s, obscure the scenery behind it and locate the local office workers who embrace the new working style. This is shown in contrast to the construction work and older housing style shown later in the pan, which highlights the older style Rome that is in the middle of its transition period on the way towards modernism and embracing capitalism. In many ways this highlights the dichotomy between the modernism of Rome and the main character in the film, who is himself trying to avoid the modernist world around him, but is slowly being engulfed by his surroundings. The film in question comes in The Fifth Chord. Released in 1971 and in the early part of the Giallo boom, the film concerns a journalist in Andrea Bild who goes on the hunt for murders around him, where at the same time he is also suspected of the crime by authorities. The main character locates himself outside of the society in which he lives in and harps back to a time before politics and representation for all were heading in a progressive direction. Bill's ex-wife has recently separated from him, which at the time would be seen as a big surprise, where he is used to the commitment in partnership and the unchanging vows in marriage. The new somewhat progressive society that has come from the 70s in Italy means that a woman has more control over her own destiny, with the divorce law coming into rule in Italy and mainly being pushed through by socialist and leftist politicians who held a lot of power at the time. For Bill, this was something he was struggling to come to terms with. He is clearly in a period of turmoil in his life. There are many times where he's seen as excessively drinking throughout it, to try and find an escape from the lack of recognition he feels from society and the people around him. His own home acts as a relic of the forgotten past, which reflects the pop art style and artistic decor of the 60s, rather than the progressive and minimalistic features of the 70s world around him. It's also one of the few times where you don't view Bill behind a border. The only time this is seen in his own home is when his new girlfriend Lou is there, where she is located behind the border between another room window and the kitchen. This itself highlights how Bill feels distance from others who have embraced this period of change, and therefore he can only communicate with her through the border of his own house, which acts as a buffer and block between the two. The modernist architecture that he sees when he's outside his home shows that form should follow function, and this extreme simplification of his surroundings is something that Bill can't get to grips with. The buildings find a way of towering above Bill, creating a boundary between him, nature, and the environment around him. The cinematography here highlights this by a lot of the time creating a boundary between the audience and viewing Bill, showing how he isn't always at one with society. It frustrates him because he isn't able to see what he wants to see of the world due to these borders, which a lot of the time leave him second-guessing other people's moves who don't have this boundary. Even when outside and away from the borders of modernist architecture, the feeling of the bustling city is never really there for Bill. This is seen when many times the reflections of the scenery around him are seen through the windows of cars or buildings he is in, but it reflects the fact he is never truly getting to experience it because it is just beyond touching distance. They create the illusion of freedom he so clearly wants, but is always on the other side of the glass and therefore can't get to it. Bill may use his lack of representation by society to infuse his loneliness he feels towards it, but in fact he may not be the only one in the film that feels this way. It could be argued that the person who turns out to be the murderer in Edward, Vermont, himself experiences the same feelings, often finding himself impaired by the modernist surroundings around him and roaming the lonely streets of Rome. The difference between them is also the fact that Vermont can find ways to use the environment around him to his own advantage. This is also seen when Vermont goes to kill Julia by the nearby lake and uses the surroundings around him to pervade detection. To build this dominating structure over the bridge for the motorway would be something he fears most because it both overwhelms him and also signifies an open society where everyone is welcome, For Vermont, however, he uses this to be able to take advantage of others by using the barriers of modernism not as something that gets in his way, but that he can use to his own gain. In many ways, Andrew Beale can be seen as the anti-hero in the film. He has no interest in living in a society that has been created around him, and throughout turns to alcohol or getting with his ex-wife who no longer has any interest in him. This in many ways are what the Giallos of the 70s are all about. They take people from different backgrounds and use the genre of the psychological thriller to show their feelings towards society. This can be either shown through the character's actions or, like in The Fifth Chord, through the camera work and framing that it uses. It's used to highlight the ambivalence towards modernity that is seen in the film. It doesn't necessarily say that progress is bad and doesn't tell the audience what to feel about it, but highlights how society has mixed feelings about the way in which society was progressing.